Hello and welcome to my channel. Here's another charcoal landscape. It's a drawing of a winding river. Let me show you how it was done. First I need to do the sketch and work out the composition, and for that I'm going to use a piece of willow charcoal. It's soft, natural charcoal that's easy to erase and modify, so it's good for sketches where you don't want to commit to any lines. We're just doing a little bit of planning. And the main part of this planning process or sketching process will be drawing the shape of that winding river. You can see how it's sort of disappearing in the distance, and it's getting wider and wider towards our viewpoint. The line of the horizon will be about 2/3 of the height of the paper. After that, I'm going to use some charcoal powder. You can buy charcoal powder or create it by sharpening or grinding down some of your pencils. So I'm going to spread that onto the top part of the paper and start blending with a brush. I'm blending gently, just sort of pushing the charcoal around just to distribute it more evenly with a brush. And after that I'm going to use a piece of paper, a paper towel, because that will allow me to blend a bit more thoroughly. So I'm just going to start blending this using a combination of circular motions and back and forth motions until I get a fairly smooth grey area. I wanted a little bit of value there, something to work with, and after that I'm going to continue working with charcoal powder, adding bit by bit using a brush on these distant hills. I want these to be darker than the sky, and I want a fairly clean edge between those distant mountains and the sky. To create a clean edge, what you want to do is you want to point the tip of the flat brush towards the edge you're trying to create, or preserve rather, and that way you will push the material to the edge and no further. Whereas when you point the tip of the brush away from the edge, then you'll create a blurry edge. Right now I'm trying to add a bit more value at the bottom here near the horizon, where I'm going to add some clouds. And first I started with a brush, and after that I continued with a tortillon. A tortillon can be used as a blending tool, but it can also be used as a drawing tool, because when it picks up a little bit of charcoal or graphite, whatever it is that you're working with, you can draw shapes with it, and these shapes are usually lighter than the ones that you draw with a charcoal pencil. They're also less defined in terms of edges, and they have less texture, but this is exactly what I need for these light clouds in the distance. So I need softer edges and less contrast, and for that a combination of a brush and a tortillon seems to be doing a good job. So I want some clouds here just to have something of interest in the sky, and then I'm going to move on to the terrain. I forgot to say a few words about my materials. I'm using the Maestro woodless charcoal pencils, two grades, a medium and a soft, some willow charcoal which I already used for sketching, and of course some charcoal powder which I created by sharpening my charcoal pencils. For blending I'm using soft brushes and tortillons, and for erasing I'm going to use these pencil erasers, Kohinoor pencil erasers and kneaded erasers, but I probably won't have to use them much here. I'll just use them here and there just to lift up a little bit of value. Here I'm going over some of these distant hills just to add a bit more value, to increase the contrast between the land and the sky. And now I'm gonna go on with shading of the rest of the terrain here on the left side. I'll mostly be working from left to right because I'm right-handed and because this willow charcoal is very easy to move around and very easy to smudge, so I need to be careful about that. Each time you put something on it, like your hand or a piece of paper, it just lifts up a little bit of that material, and then you have to work over it again. So I don't really want that. I want to be able to avoid smudging as much as possible. I also added a little bit of value to this river because I don't want it to be completely white. I need it to be about the same value as the lighter parts of the sky. But as for the ground here on the left, I want it to be considerably darker so that the river would stand out. So I'm just going to keep adding value little by little until I'm happy with the amount of value. I'm just going to keep adding a little bit of willow charcoal at the time. And another thing that I want to achieve is I want this bottom portion of the river bank here, of the land here, to be a little bit darker, which is why I keep adding a bit more value to it, because I want the land to get lighter and lighter near the horizon, because it's further away and because it's getting lighter because of the atmospheric effect. And here around the river bank we're going to have some trees and bushes and also a little bit more shadow at the bottom. So I'm just going to add a bit more value using this willow charcoal, and then maybe even a touch of compressed charcoal from my charcoal pencil, because I not only want a bit more value in that area because it's closer to our viewpoint, I also want a bit more texture there. So a charcoal pencil is definitely going to produce more texture, so that's another thing that I can use to my advantage. Whenever you're working in charcoal, you need to try to get to know the effects of the tools you're using, because different forms of charcoal behave differently and leave different kinds of marks. So you need to be able to use that to your advantage. So like I said, a little bit more shadow here at the bottom. There's going to be a reflection, but this part where we have some shadows will need to be a little bit darker. There's also going to be some trees and bushes here, like I said, and right now I'm starting to work on the first cluster of trees here. And what I'm doing here is I'm just sort of scribbling with my pencil, trying to produce a texture that kind of looks like canopies of trees and kind of looks like foliage as seen from a distance. So I don't really need to define every single shape. I just want it to look like a group, like a cluster of bushes or trees. And naturally these clusters will be getting smaller and smaller as you look further in the distance, and the ones which are closer to us are going to appear larger and more defined. They're also going to be a little bit darker, they're going to have a little bit more texture, whereas the ones which are further away, I'm going to try to use a bit less material on them to make them a bit lighter, and I'm also going to try to soften them a little bit in terms of texture by using more of my blending tools. So more texture, more contrast and more value on the parts of the land which is closer to our viewpoint, and less of that as you look further in the distance closer to the horizon. So now I'm going to start adding some trees which are closer to the horizon. And like I said, here I'm going to use a little bit less of the material. I'm also going to blend a bit more. So I'm making even smaller marks now. Just making tiny circular marks with my charcoal pencil. I actually think I'm just going to need to use a medium charcoal pencil for this. I probably don't need anything darker. Maybe a touch of soft charcoal pencil for some of the shadow areas on the right, but we'll see. So just using these tiny marks to make some indications of the position of these distant trees, and notice how much lighter these are in the distance. You can still tell that there's something there in the distance, but it's obviously a lot less defined and there is less contrast. It's more difficult to discern the actual shapes. Not that I need to do too much to these shapes which are closer to the foreground, near the river bank, but with those at least you can it's easier to tell that it's a group of trees. Maybe I can introduce a little bit of variation in the terrain by taking away a bit of value here and there using either an eraser or a brush, but no need to do too much to that now. There needs to be some reflection here in the water. So I'm going to add some using this piece of willow charcoal. It's a tiny piece of willow charcoal. There's barely any left. I do have some more, but this one is still getting the job done, so why not use it? So I'd sort of smudge that charcoal that I put down, and I pull it horizontally first, and then I pull it downwards to smear it a little bit. Maybe I can create some indications of ripples here and there using a pencil eraser, just to create some indications of the movement of the water. But if I don't like them, I can just subdue them a little bit, soften them so that they don't stand out too much. This corner here also needs to be a little bit darker because it's reflecting an area of darker value. So when it comes to reflections, they don't need to be super detailed, and they're going to be distorted by the movement of the water anyway. The only thing that you need to pay attention to is the general shape and the general position of the darker and lighter values. So when you want to try to make a nice looking reflection, just try to match the lighter and the darker areas roughly, and that'll probably be good enough in most cases. And with a few suggestions of ripples here and there, it'll look like an actual surface of the water. I'm actually moving on to the right side of this river bank here and just drawing around the shape of the river, just drawing the line of the river bank. And notice how jagged the shape is and how irregular the shape is here where the river is disappearing in the distance, but that's because of the angle of viewing and the foreshortening. And as it gets closer and closer to the foreground area, it becomes smoother and straighter, and shapes become larger. So I need to cover this whole area with a bit of willow charcoal. As you can tell, this tiny piece of willow charcoal was actually my main drawing tool throughout the drawing process here. And after that I did some blending with a brush. Willow charcoal and vine charcoal, this natural charcoal, is so easily moved around with a brush. It's just like painting, or it's actually very similar to watercolor. And just like watercolor, for example, when you're using watercolor, you can lift up color with your brush. You can do something similar here. With a clean brush you can lift up some of the material and make some areas lighter if you want. So that's a very neat quality of the willow charcoal that allows you to accomplish a lot with just a few strokes of a brush. Now I'm drawing some more trees in the distance here, and I want to have some trees here where the river is bending. I want to have it look like the river is disappearing behind that bend and behind those trees all the way in the distance. And I'm just making some indications of where those groups of trees are. Just drawing some of these smaller shapes and then softening them a bit with my Tortillion. And of course, as I've already mentioned, I want these to be lighter than the ones that I'm about to draw in the foreground. I can modify their shape here and there if I don't like something, using an eraser and some other tools, but I'm mostly not particularly worried about any specific shapes. Now, as I'm moving closer to the foreground area, I need to put more and more of these darker and more defined shapes. So here I'm going to have like a hill or a slope that's going to be darker because it's covered with some trees. So kind of like a wooded slope on this side of the river. When you're working in charcoal and you're drawing landscapes, there's so much you can do just by allowing the pencil to work for you. You just drag the pencil and allow it to create some texture, and then you can choose to soften that texture or use it to your advantage and maybe turn it into a shape or something that will look like a shape to the viewer. Here at the bottom I'm drawing some trees here, some shapes of trees and bushes which are much closer to the river, and I'm also going to draw some taller trees. These are a little bit closer to us now. So I'm just trying to figure out what kind of trees I want to draw here. And initially I started with some deciduous trees with a few bare branches, but wasn't really happy with the overall shape and the how that particular canopy was interacting with the rest of the scenery. But I'm still sort of modifying things a little bit here with the Tortillion. Now I'm going to draw another taller tree here, and I want the tree to stand out against the background. I want it to obscure a part of the sky and a part of the background and that hill on the right. And the reason why I want it to be so tall and to obscure so much of the background is so that I could create contrast and so that I could create some kind of reference object for the viewer against which they can gauge the distance. So it helps me create depth in my scene when I have such a tall object in the foreground which is sticking out and almost showing a little bit against the sky as well. So there's some nice contrast there. Here I decided to rework the shape and the appearance of the canopy of this other tree to the left of the tall one, and I decided to turn it into another coniferous looking tree, and then I drew a few more to the right and added a bit more shadow under them so that I could show that this slope here, which is closer to us, is kind of curving away from us and sloping down towards the river bank, I suppose. But I'm going to cover the rest of this area here with some willow charcoal. It's a very quick and easy way to establish a base value. You can always add a little more, make it a little bit darker. You can take away a bit of value. So here I added a few more trees on that slope, and now the whole landscape is starting to take shape, and all I have to do is do a little bit of refining on some of the details, but I've already placed pretty much all of the elements that I wanted to place. I'm just going to soften some of the textures here on some of these trees in the foreground, because in some of these shapes the texture was a little bit too grainy. Maybe I like when there is a little bit of texture to entertain the eye of the viewer, but sometimes too much can be distracting and counterproductive, I suppose. Adding a little bit more value here to the foreground area, and I can create some nice effects with my brush. I just dab vertically with my brush, and I can create some suggestions of grass, maybe some clumps of grass here in the foreground. I can use it to move that willow charcoal around. I can use it to lift up a little bit of charcoal, creating some lighter blades of grass, or maybe lighter clumps of grass, adding some irregularities in the terrain. And you can see that it already looks like grassy terrain without me having to do much, really. I didn't have to draw every single blade of grass. Now, to make that even more interesting, I can create some of these lighter marks that'll look like flowers. For that, I'm going to use a kneaded eraser shaped into a sort of a teardrop shape with a nice fine tip at the end. And you can see how it's lifting up a little bit of charcoal, and I can vary the size a bit, make the ones which are closer to us a bit lighter, I suppose. And I can also vary the distribution a little bit, make some of them packed more tightly together in one area and then barely any of them in the other. So there's no need to overdo it. Just a few flowers here and there will complete the scene and make the foreground more interesting. And now I'm back to working on the midground here, because I decided that I needed some more of these darker clusters of trees and bushes in the distance, just to balance things out, because I have those on the left. I want some on the right, because I also want that gradual transition from the darker, more defined objects in the foreground and the lighter and lighter ones in the background. Here also adding some details using a tortillon. Let me remind you, you can use your tortillon as a drawing tool. When it picks up a little bit of charcoal, you can create some interesting effects with it. So rather than using a pencil, which would create much cleaner, more definite marks, I can create softer marks and easily modify them with a tortillon. I'm just doing a little bit more work on this slope in the foreground, because I'm close to finishing this piece. So some people requested charcoal landscapes, because a lot of my viewers prefer charcoal, and I haven't done much charcoal lately. So I thought this would be a nice scene. It's not horribly complex, and at the same time I think it's a very nice composition, and you have everything you need in it. And I hope that the video and the drawing process will be both interesting and useful to you. I'm doing a little bit of softening of some of these shapes and making some of them a bit darker. Also, this hill or mountain in the background, I realized that it needed to be a bit darker. Here at the bottom, I'm adding a bit more shadow and simplifying some of the shapes using that same piece of willow charcoal, and adding just a few more touches of this here and there. If you like this video, please don't forget to subscribe. Also give me a like and comment. All of these actions mean a lot for my channel. If you want to see longer videos and more content, you should check out my Patreon. I'm going to put my signature here in the lower right corner, and now the drawing is done. I hope you enjoyed the drawing process. Don't forget to check out my other videos. I have lots of landscapes, both in charcoal and colored pencil. So that's it for now. Thanks for watching. I'm going to see you in the next one. Bye.